This content is intended for mature audiences and may contain strong opinions or language. Views or opinions expressed by guests or the host should not be considered as medical, financial, legal, or psychiatric advice and are not to be attributed to this platform or its sponsors. Hello, wonderful people. Thank you for joining us on an episode of Bobbing Along with Bob featuring your host, Bob Dub. We are so glad you decided to join us for one of our discussions with many of our interesting and informative guests who are going to share their knowledge, insight, opinion, and most importantly, their life experiences with all of you. If you enjoy this content, please like and share as well as subscribe. Feel free to use the comment section to share your life experiences on today's topic. You can also find the host on minds.com/BobDub. And now, here is your host, Bob Dub.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Bobbing Along. This is the Shakespeare edition of Bobbing Along, and today we are investigating whether we should in fact be quoting Christopher Marlowe and not quoting Shakespeare at all. So to help me in this very interesting and complex investigation into the court of Elizabeth I, the police state of Elizabethan England, and the intrigue around the theatre of those times, I have with me Otto X of Navakavada Buddhism. Hey, Otto.
Hello.
Welcome. How are you doing?
Oh, pretty good. Very good to be here. Looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Awesome. Awesome. Me too. And I also have Roger of Roger Hansen Live, who has taken time out of his incredibly busy streaming schedule to join us today. So welcome, Roger.
Thank you.
How are you doing, Roger?
I'm glad to be here too. I'm doing pretty good. This is actually the highlight of my day. So.
Oh, you're too kind. That's awesome.
Oh,
well, Roger. Yeah.
I love it. I love Shakespeare's the stuff right here. I love it.
And you were just talking to me just before we came onto the show about how Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe were born almost on the same day.
Yeah. Well, at first they kept saying that it was the same day, but I did further research and found out that if you go according to the old style dates that England used, Marlowe's birthday was most likely about a few days before, and that would make him about 2 months older than William Shakespeare, I believe they said.
Gosh, that's so amazing. And he was baptized at the same time.
Wait, yeah, baptized. It was his baptism, not when he was born. It was his baptism. Sorry.
His baptism. Oh, okay. Gosh, that's
right.
pretty...
I was going to say, baptism certificates is often the way we find out about these guys.
Huh.
Yeah.
They're a great source.
Glad you said that. I did say birth, which that's a big difference too than the actual baptism, because
it shows they were born. And the thing about the baptism, I think they usually figure that traditionally they baptize the kids within 3 days.
Oh.
So when they have a baptism certificate, they usually consider that shows the birth date is like 2 or 3 days beforehand. So they didn't actually have birth certificates so much, although they did record births sometimes. But everybody had a baptism certificate. That was a lot more likely. So it's basically, I think most historians consider it the equivalent of a birth certificate. I mean, after all, you had to be born to be baptized. and it was the kind of paperwork that would more or less survive. So it's perfectly valid to look at the birth or the baptismal certificates, and it gives you a pretty good idea of when these guys were born, probably within a day or two. So they didn't let kids sit around for too long, because kids didn't survive that long. It was a rough time, so they got you baptized as quickly as they could.
Yeah. So Marlowe baptized February the 26th. Oh, 2 months, making him 2 months older than William Shakespeare, who was baptized the 26th of April. That's pretty weird. So, but we've established that there are two different people. There are definitely these two different people, even though there's this strange coincidence of their birth.
But that's also assuming that Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon was actually the Shakespeare that wrote the plays.
Right.
Right.
Yes. Which is what we're looking at.
The problem is too, sometimes we have these records, and here's a guy named Christopher Marlowe, and of course it's spelt like 3 or 4 different ways. So you there are times when you make an assumption, well, we know he was at Cambridge or wherever. We find a record at Cambridge of somebody with a name spelled kind of like his at the same time. So, because he spelled it Marlowe, Marley, a lot of times it was phonetic spelling. Because they didn't it was a vernacular language. They didn't care about, spelling the way they would if it was Latin or Greek. These, just English they still had a holdover, looking on it as just this temporary language that would change. And of course, the English Renaissance that Marlowe and Shakespeare's writings, whoever wrote them, really helped to usher this in. That's when we started wanting to spell words the same way every time, instead of having it be a free-for-all of phonetic spelling, which, you read those old manuscripts and those old books even, it's so difficult sometimes to just read them the way we're so used to reading now. Bob, you and I were talking about reading silently to yourself, which is a more modern phenomenon. Books were generally meant to be read aloud, and stories were listened to aloud, but we have this thing where we can read silently to ourselves a lot faster than someone can speak. But a part of that, I think, is because we have this uniform way of spelling the words now and uniform typesets, so that you can kind of glide over the words. You don't have to stop and spell out, the same word 3 different ways in the same paragraph, as you do sometimes with these Elizabethan and Jacobean books. And people that wrote these plays, I think, kind of fueled that. As the language became more accepted as a way of expressing things artistically, I think people became more serious about English as a language. Remember, there wasn't even a dictionary really until Dr. Johnson came along in the 18th century. I think it was late 18th, early 19th century. When was Johnson active? Up to 1800 something or other. But yeah, I mean, when you think about it, I'm sure there had been other smaller glossaries and things, but that was really the first real dictionary of the language. It took that long before we took our own language seriously. It's kind of amazing.
It is amazing.
It's one thing that I did find out too, which when you're talking about all that, and I didn't know until just recently when I was doing research for this, but Marlowe was actually one of the first to get a reputation for using blank verse, which became the standard now. That's something. I didn't know that until just doing the research to do this show. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
And that ties right into the whole authorship question, because one of the things that even the mainstream Stratfordian scholars admit, that a lot of the Shakespeare plays, especially the early ones, had the hands of more than one author. These were working theater companies that needed a play that would sell, so they would bring in other writers. The material was changing all the time, sort of like a Marx Brothers. You watch a Marx Brothers movie and it's very funny, but when they did their stage shows, they varied the show each night and interacted with the audience. So there have been more than one mainstream scholar that suggests that Marlowe was responsible for a lot of the blank verse in Shakespeare. You're saying he was the master of blank verse. If you needed blank verse, he was the guy you called in to do a writing job. And these were working writers, working playwrights, working actors. So they were always, playing with their material. And heck, a lot of the actors were probably illiterate. They had to learn their material by rote, just hearing it recited. Someone, again, reading aloud to them, which was how most people absorb stuff. So, yeah, he was the blank verse master, and you can see the style in some of the Shakespeare plays. It really looks like Marlowe wrote that. So that's an indicator that, if you admit that far, maybe you can admit that Marlowe wrote more than just that.
Yeah. And, let me also point out too, I said it in the last episode, but I'll say it again. I understand that Marlowe did die early, okay? But I'm not saying that Marlowe was the only person that wrote Shakespeare. You know what I mean?
Right.
like there was a whole, in my take of it, there was a whole group of men, maybe even women, I don't know, but they who wrote these stories, and he was one of them. Just because he died doesn't mean that they just, close up shop and it's done, That's all I was getting at,
That makes a lot of sense, because it does, seem like you'd need a whole committee of writers to cover all the different aspects of the plays, because you've got like this incredible blank verse in places, and you've got people that have knowledge of the law and of seamanship and of soldiering, and some of the plays that set like in Italy show knowledge of like the geography and of the politics there. So, it would be tough for one person to be a sailor and a lawyer. But what you're talking about, that would work, because you got a group that you can tap their skills. And like you're saying, just because one member dies, you don't shut up shop. You keep soldiering on. But yeah, and there definitely was a Philip Marlowe. No, right? There definitely was a Christopher Marlowe, and
Yes.
who we have records of his birth and his death, and you do have some issues with his attribution as the author of even his own plays. Though one interesting thing, and I was reading this article by a guy named Matthew Walker, and he talks about the fact that in his lifetime, none of Marlowe's plays were published under his name. They were all published anonymously. It was only after he died that the plays came out with his name on them. Now that is explainable. Not, a lot of plays were simply pirated. They would just because people wanted to read the plays or stage them themselves. And people were more interested in getting that signed check. They didn't care so much about authorship credit necessarily. And also the plays were a bit politically inflammatory sometimes. So you might want to distance yourself from them. Oh, I didn't write that. My name's not on it, But at the same time, it's kind of suggestive, because that's another aspect of the theory. Maybe Marlowe didn't write Shakespeare. Maybe Shakespeare wrote Marlowe. And,
wow.
That's, you can look at it that way too. Although again, yeah, it's just suggestive, because Marlowe was referred to by other writers as another writer, but I don't think we have any direct letters or anything linking him specifically to specific plays that he wrote. I need to dig into that a little more myself, to tell you the truth, because I was just reading this today. I really should have. I wish I'd found this. I'd read this article like years ago, and I just remembered it today. And I wish I'd thought of it earlier, because I would have posted it for you guys to take a look at. And I'll share the link. But I think that's kind of suggestive, just that there's no name on the plays as long as he was alive. But after he died, they started putting his name on some of these. So,
well, if you share that link with us, I'll pop it down in the description after the show, so anybody who's interested can go and.
I'll put it on the chat here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, cool.
And the thing too about Marlowe is like with these discussions, the reason why I got so excited about this episode was because of Marlowe. You know what I mean? Marlowe is like the bread and butter of this whole story. You know, Shakespeare. this theory right here, which it's not a conspiracy. Everybody likes to call it that, but it's not. All right. This is actually a theory, and it's a valid one because there's actual evidence backing up these people's claims. You know, but the whole thing about this with Marlowe, what makes him the bread and butter of all of it is the fact that his story is insane. I mean, just completely insane. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And the farther you dig into Christopher Marlowe's life, the crazier it gets.
That is amazing. Okay, so I'm going to ask you now, Roger, to start us off at his school. He went to. Let's dig. Let's start digging at his school because weird stuff happened at his school. Was it King's Cross? Was it?
He was 14, and when he was a pupil at King's school at Canterbury on a scholarship, and 2 years later, a student at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. He studied through a scholarship with expectations that he would become an Anglican clergyman, which, by the way, I don't agree with that. There is no way Christopher Marlowe wanted to be an Anglican clergyman.
Which is fascinating. So why he was there at all is weird. But then when he came to get his degree, he had to get special permission. What was that about, Otto?
Well, again, we're going by like the records we have. And apparently, according to the records, Marlowe simply was skipping class a lot. Sometimes he'd be gone the whole term. And it was getting near time when they would traditionally be giving him his master's degree. They'd be examining him. And at that time, they didn't actually have written examinations. You basically hung out with a couple of professors, had a glass of sherry or whatever. And after a discussion, they would decide whether you showed sufficient, knowledge of your subject. Plus, it was expected they would know how much work you'd done over the year. They knew their pupils. So it was getting time for him to get his master's, and they're like, well, he's never around. All he does is eat. Should we even give him a master's? I don't think, we want to give him this. So the government sent a special letter signed by some very powerful people, including people involved with the intelligence services, shall we say. And they even mentioned specifically that the Queen herself did not like the idea of his degree being withheld because he had been on good service for the government. He'd basically it's generally interpreted that he was working as a spy for the British government and probably involved in the entrapment of overseas Catholics. And so basically the Privy Council instructed them to give Marlowe his degree. So this was seen as a direct reward, one of his rewards for his work as an undercover agent. Here's a master's degree.
Fascinating. So from the Privy Council.
Yeah, let me see if I got the exact. I tried to have some. Let me see. Try to have some reference material right here. Let's see.
While you're looking that up, Otto, I'm going to just ask Roger. Roger, didn't you mention something about one of Queen Elizabeth's nieces or something? What was that story?
We can discuss that, but that comes right after what he's doing right now. I mean, this is the Privy Council is really important, okay? Because like there's a guy that's involved in that, and with the niece of Mary, Bloody Mary. What was her name? Queen of Scots.
Oh, Mary. Yeah.
Mary. Okay. And Sir Francis Walsingham was in charge of the Privy Council. Okay. And he's the one who was was giving the message to Cambridge to allow Marlowe to graduate. And whenever he did that, he had a letter that commended Marlowe for his faithful dealing and good service to the Queen. And that was what ended up getting him his degree and graduating. The nature of his services, though, it wasn't specified by the council, but its letter to Cambridge authorities was documented in their minutes. They don't have record of what the letter that was sent to them, but they do have it in the minutes for the Privy Council.
Right.
Now, the focus that I wanted to mention, though, was Sir Francis Walsingham. Okay. Now, he was the big guy. He was the one that was sending these spies out to do their secret, secret service stuff, top secret stuff. So, whenever it comes to Marlowe, there's been allegations that says that he was Mary of Scots' niece's tutor. Okay. But at the same time, they also have records showing that he was in jail. Now, if this was secret service work that he's doing, they would have stuff like that in place, you know what I mean, for a cover, so that it would give an excuse for why he wasn't where he was supposed to be. So that's something you also have to think, espionage and the whole
espionage and jail. And so did you find that reference there, Otto?
I did. This is a quote from the Mather article. So it's, some of his interpretation. He goes, as far back as June of, here he's, we now know that some of the irregularities about Marlowe's career resulted because he was a spy working for the Elizabethan Secret Service. As far back as June of 1587, the Privy Council sent a sharply worded letter to the authorities of Cambridge University, where Marlowe was enrolled, regarding a student named Christopher Morley, without doubt Armand Marley. Morley, who was due to receive his MA degree the following month, was being, quote, defamed, unquote, by certain people who sought to block his candidature. The council said, among other things, in their reprimand that, quote, he had done Her Majesty good service and deserved to be rewarded for his faithful dealing. Then they even resorted to name dropping, saying, quote, it was not Her Majesty's pleasure that anyone employed as he had been in matters touching the benefit of his country should be defamed by those that are ignorant in the affairs he went about. Now, of course, this doesn't prove that he was a spy, and as Roger points out, they never actually specified what it was he was doing. However, when the Privy Council itself is writing a letter like this, they were extremely powerful. They wielded awesome power, and aside from the Queen herself, the Privy Council, they had a lot of clout. So for them to actually intervene like this, it'd be like, I don't know, it'd be like the National Security Agency or something writing a letter, hey, or the cabinet. So it's very suggestive. It's very suggestive. And we do know he was hanging out with people that were also involved in espionage. And of course, you wouldn't write about that or talk about it too much. Although you never know what might pop up later. They're always finding new documents. We can always hope something more specific will come up. But I do agree it is kind of an assumption, because the Privy Council notes don't say anything about specific espionage work.
Mm. Okay, so another interesting thing that comes up with this Privy Council involvement and the spying and the Nice and the looking overseas for Catholics and all this stuff is that just around about this time, the Privy Council was beheading a whole lot of people, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was one of the things they could do. And they had been beheading people just in the previous months to Marlowe's death for religious irregularities. They felt very, very threatened by the England itself was now a Protestant country, but their Protestantism was not really all that Protestant, at least from the point of view of people that were even further along in their attempts to reform the Catholic religion. So, you had like Puritans and people that wanted much, much simpler forms of organization for the church. One of the objections to the Roman Catholic Church was the immense amount of wealth that was concentrated in the hands of the Pope. Well, there were people arguing that the immense amounts of wealth concentrated in the hands of the Archbishop of Canterbury was just as bad, if not worse. So, and of course, this was seen as a direct threat to the state. And of course, the Archbishop being himself the guy that prosecuted a lot of these people, he had a particular axe to grind, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, any kind of religion and politics were basically the same thing at the time. And I mean, the Pope had been like basically putting contracts out on Elizabeth for years. Their stated goal was to remove her from the throne and place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne as the only legitimate Catholic Stuart ruler. That was one of the reasons why bringing James down from Scotland was seen as a great way of healing a lot of the religious tensions, because you got to remember too, but from Elizabeth's point of view, half her subjects were probably recusant Catholics. That is to say, Catholics who were forced into Anglican form, but who still stayed faithful to the Catholic religion. They even had a form that they could sign with their priest before they were forcibly converted, saying, I'm only being forced to convert. And the priest said, it's okay. You can still be a Catholic, and you have to pretend. So they were the recusants. So at least half, if not more, of Elizabeth's subjects had religious reservations about her legitimacy. So James would remove that sort of thing. So, But in the meantime, the Elizabethan government felt it was very vulnerable to any sort of religious irregularity that could weaken it in the face of the Catholic attacks. And a lot of the times, I think they would probably blame a lot of this unrest on Jesuit agents. It was also an interesting thing. That's when priests stopped shaving the tops of their heads, like Friar Tuck the tonsure. That was very strictly old Catholic priests for the longest time, but it was the wars in religion when they would try to send Jesuit missionaries into these countries that had converted to Protestantism, and all they do is they catch somebody with their head shaved and they just burn them. So priests were allowed to stop shaving their heads, and they never took it up again, which is weird. But I don't know why I thought of that.
That's very interesting. It's full of intrigue, because the more you talk about it, the more this aspect of religion seems to be hugely prominent. Because, Roger, you said that Marlowe was possibly being used as a spy with Queen Mary, Mary, Queen of Scots' niece. Now, if they were the Catholics and Elizabeth were the Anglicans, then and Marlowe was in a school to be an Anglican priest, it does seem as this is all religious wars, doesn't it?
Yeah, and with that too, on there's also speculations from two people. One's Park Hannon and Charles Nicholl, and they speculated that Marlowe was a government spy, okay? And they also go further, and they say that in 1857, when the Privy Council ordered the University of Cambridge to award Marlowe his degree, it denied rumors that he intended to go to the English Catholic College in Rheims, saying instead that he had been engaged in unspecified affairs on matters touching the benefit of his country, But they say that he was actually going to go to the English Catholic College in Rheims instead of being angelic thing, and
Mm-hmm.
if he was a spy, then that would be his way in. You know what I mean? He would go in, he'd get an education with the Catholic Church. He would end up going and becoming a tutor, like they're talking about, and tutoring somebody close to Queen Mary of Scots.
Yes.
That's the way I see it. I mean,
How extraordinary. So another very interesting thing that comes up, I mean, I know that we haven't even touched on his writing with all these intrigues happening around him, but a very interesting thing about his death comes up where they say that they suggest that he was murdered because he was having a gay affair with somebody. That's a really strange thing now to bring into the middle of all this religious intrigue. Is there
Well,
evidence? Sorry?
that's one reason why I said that, like, if you really check it out, and I don't like getting caught up in a lot of the new age stuff that's coming out when it comes to this, but like with this situation, it is a possibility. There is a lot of underground movements taking place during that time period, which concerned atheism, it concerned homosexuality. And like I said, people who were nobles wouldn't be caught at the place. You know what I mean? That was the place where the nobles didn't go, because to them, that's where the reprobates went. So in order for them to go to the place, they had to sneak in there and make it to where nobody knew that they were there, So you had a lot of things going on during that time period that, there could have been homosexuality going on too. I mean, there's a good chance, that is valid.
Mm.
Yeah, it might have been a factor, certainly, but we have to keep in mind as well that that was also something that you would throw at an enemy, while he's gay, whatever. And interesting, at the same time, you did have public men, Sir Francis Bacon, for example, Anthony Bacon, and others who were publicly called, from the pulpits, declared to be homosexuals, and nothing much ever had. Of course, as you point out, the very wealthy, powerful, they don't really have anything much to fear from that. Something like that probably wouldn't be all that action in and of itself, but it would be one of the things that were heaped upon him. One of the things that they found digging through the archives are these accusations that he was an atheist, and in fact had composed an atheist sermon or an atheist book, because he was a divinity student, and as a divinity student, he read the Bible with a very critical eye, and said, the kind of guy that says, well, maybe the ravens weren't feeding Elijah, maybe Elijah was feeding the ravens. He had some,
yeah,
just looking, saying, wait, we can explain these miracles and stuff like that. And it's interesting getting back, circling back, if you'll pardon the expression, to talking about Marlowe possibly going overseas to the Catholics and going to the Catholic University there. It wasn't necessarily uncommon for someone who was being trained in the Anglican Church to be reading all of these church fathers and decide, hey, wait a minute, I think Catholicism is the real deal. So, some of them did go and do that. And actually, to this day, if you're an Anglican priest, because they like getting priests, and you decide to switch over to the Church of Rome, they make you a full Roman priest of the Roman Rite, and if you're married, you get to keep your wife. So there are actually married Roman Catholic priests. Not very many, but any Anglican priest that wants to be a married Roman Catholic priest can do that, which
Gosh,
is
how
another
interesting.
thought.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when they say atheist, they might not have meant a non-believer. They might have meant that he believed the doctrine of the other side.
Possibly. It was, again, very much a political kind of a judgment. And to them, atheism was denying the gospel and denying the teachings of the church. And, of course, that included the teaching that the Queen ruled by divine right. As Farley points out in his article on the subject, atheism meant that oaths meant nothing in court, and that there was no reason to engage in religious wars. Why should we go and invade a Catholic country just because they're Catholic? Wait a minute, if that's that's all nonsense. I don't think it would preclude him having other spiritual or even other religious beliefs. I think at that time, atheism was seen as just disbelief in the Christian faith, and since all other faiths were false anyway, obviously you believed in no God, since there was only one God to believe in. But he seemed to be very much a materialist, from what we know of him. I don't think that he was like a secret Mussulman, as they called it back then, or a devil worshiper or anything wacky like that. I think he just kind of, at a time when religion was, in Protestantism especially, pushes the authority of the scriptures, as opposed to the traditional Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church as well. They lean more heavily on tradition, later interpretations, and metaphorical ideas, whereas the Protestantism was really pushing hard. Just read the scriptures; that'll give you all the answers. And he read them with a hypercritical eye, a very intelligent eye, and started seeing all these holes. Because of course it's an immensely complex book written by many different people, many of them with very different and subtle ideas about divinity, then variously edited, then translated a couple or three times. He found a lot of the holes you could drive a bus through. And these aren't a problem to a person that approaches it from a religious standpoint or a spiritual standpoint, but he wasn't doing it that way. So for him to attack the scriptures like that meant to attack the whole edifice of religion. He had nothing else to fall back on spiritually. And so he just became what we would call, I think, a materialist, an Epicurean, a believer in the atomic theory, as they had it back then, atomism. So.
Gosh. What a fascinating man he is.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's just my guess anyway.
Yeah. Roger, what did you say about him being involved in counterfeiting?
Well, yeah, and this kind of goes with something that I did want to bring. I'll let that squeaky door pass before I say it, but the counterfeiting kind of fits into what we were talking about with the excessive eating in college. Okay, now Marlowe, when Otto was talking about him doing nothing but sitting around to eating a lot, the thing about it is with Marlowe, when he was in college, he was eating excessively. They do have records of when he was in college and his expenses and what he bought from the cafeterias and stuff like that. And they say for how much money he should have been getting, okay, with his scholarship income, he was he was living way above his means. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So he was going to college, and while he was in college, he wasn't attending class like he was supposed to. And when he was there, he was living lavishly and spending money that he shouldn't have had. So that was one thing that really connects him to it. And another thing with the spy ring and everything, they do believe that he was involved with being a counterfeit they also believe that he was also the guy called Morley, who was the tutor of Arbella Stewart, and
Right.
that was in 1589. Now, this all goes back to Francis Bacon. Now, Francis Bacon's uncle, his name was William Cecil. Okay. And William Cecil was also involved with the, what is it, the Privy Council?
Yeah. He and his son Robert. Yeah.
And from what I've found out during the time that Marlowe was over in Europe and the counterfeiting thing happened, Cecil was also there, and so was Francis Wiltshire or whatever his name was. I just said it a little while ago, but
Right.
they were all in the same basic area at the same time during that time period. So for me, I could see the counterfeiting taking place and him being actually involved in counterfeiting and getting busted and all that good stuff. So I don't have the story on how all that went down straight 100%, but maybe Otto could fill in the blanks there.
I don't really have much more on it as far as the counterfeiting. I do know that at the time, counterfeiting was a very serious crime, and the Elizabethan police state, Secret Service, would usually do what we would call massive entrapment. So, and there was one of the accusations leveled against Marlowe was that he was a coiner. I think that was in the or something called the Bainbridge Note, and there were accusations that William Kidd made about him under torture. A lot of that had to do with his atheism, but one of the things was that he had said that he had as much right to coin as anybody else, as the Queen of England. Why should the Treasury be the only one allowed to make coins? And which is actually a very anarchistic, for the time, kind of a statement. But the thing is, if he was working to entrap coiners, what they would generally do is kind of like what they do to this day. They basically suggest to someone the crime, provide a lot of the tools of the crime, get the person to engage in the crime with them, and then arrest them. After they brought in the metals and the smelting and showed them how to do it, and then got them to help them. And then it was like extreme entrapment. And of course, when you entrap someone like that, you could either just, have them, tried and executed, or you could use them as further aids held by blackmail, because the punishment for coining, you see, the coin had a picture of the Queen on it. So counterfeiting a coin was considered a form of treason, petty treason, but treason all the same. And so the punishment was the full drawing and quartering, which we won't describe in detail here, but basically it was pretty gruesome. And yes, they still did it quite publicly in Elizabethan times, right down to the point of after they finished quartering, you send the quarters to like 4 different places to hang up somewhere to remind people not to counterfeit coins. So it was a very effective crime to entrap someone with, because you could hold over that death over them. And that's also a way that intelligence agents get recruits sometimes. It's always like by bribery. Sometimes it's blackmail.
He hung out with a lot of very insalubrious people. I think that it's very interesting, his death. In the coroner's report, I don't know, there's controversy over which coroner's report is real, but apparently there was witnesses at his hearing. The one fellow, Robert Poley, is on record as saying, "I will swear and forswear myself rather than I will accuse myself to do me any harm." Another fellow, Nicholas Scaris, had for many years acted as a con man, drawing young men into the clutches of people in the money lending racket, including Marlowe's apparent killer, Ingram Fraser. So they weren't they weren't of noble behavior, were they? Even though they might have been of noble birth.
Crook is a crook, man.
Sorry, what was that, Roger?
Crook is a crook. I mean, you can paint it any color you want, but a crook is a crook, man. I get a kick out of that. Every time I read that, I'm like, seriously? And people try to make these guys out to be like they were noble and honorable and stuff. I'm like, are you serious? They're con men. They were liars, thieves. One of them even say that they had no problem with lying in court?
Yes, Robert
No,
Poley.
No, they
had no problem with it.
Yeah, these were guys who were, and Archie Bunker used to call your lower socioeconomic class. These are the people that live on the edges of society, and those were the people that then, as now, were often recruited to do, sort of dirty work that somebody higher up on the social ladder wouldn't want to do. You can almost make an argument there was something similar in the United States in the 19th century, where all of the unruly Italian immigrants were seen as a problem, causing crime and disturbance. So they would take the Irish immigrants, who were seen as rough and tough, but at least intelligent enough to take orders from an Englishman, and they would make them the police. That's why you have a tradition here in the U.S., at least in the northeastern U.S., of Irish policemen who were basically seen as a gang, almost human, but certainly better than those Italians. And they would often, just that same idea, you would always go to these people that were considered to be a little shady. And these guys were definitely shady types. Yeah, and they all had the relationships with people higher up in the social ladder, and and so they are actually just the perfect profile for people that would be involved, I think, in like espionage work.
Amazing. But that's not all. There's also a suggestion that he wasn't gay at all, but he was having an affair with somebody else's wife. What was that about, Roger?
Now, I believe the one part that I heard, I don't know if this is the same one, but it was Walsingham. Now, Walsingham,
from the Privy Council.
Yeah, but there's two stories, I think, that goes to that. One was that his wife was jealous of him for having romantic affairs with her husband, because he was supposed to be gay, I guess.
Oh, I see. With the husband. I thought it was with the wife.
And she was supposed to have done a hit on him because she was upset about it. And I don't know for sure, but I think I have heard where it was the other way around too, where Walsingham wanted to get rid of Marlowe because Marlowe knew too much and stuff like that. I also found in my notes too that he was arrested for counterfeiting, and it was in 1592. He was arrested in the English garrison town of Flushing, which is Vlissingen in the Netherlands, for alleged involvement in counterfeiting of coins, presumably related to the activities of seditious Catholics. He was sent to the Lord's Treasurer Burgley, but no charges or imprisonment resulted. The arrest may have disrupted another of Marlowe's spying missions, perhaps by giving the resulting coinage to the Catholic cause. he was to infiltrate the followers of the active Catholic plotters, plotter William Stanley, and report back to Burghley. Now, Stanley was the guy that there was a plot that he was doing against the Queen, where he wanted the Queen off the throne and Mary in place, and they were working on getting that done at the time. And Cecil, along with Sir Francis Walsingham, were working together through the Privy Council to deter that from happening. And he was their enemy, and it's speculated that Marlowe was supposed to infiltrate his organization with these coins, these forged coins, but he was arrested in the process of doing it.
Good heavens.
So it took me a little while to figure it out. But in the meantime, I completely forgot the name of the plot that was supposed to be taking place. I had it even in my head, and I forgot what it was from all this reading. It's like I said, this stuff is amazing. It's completely amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
But that's not the only theory, is it? What were you telling me, Otto, about it being related to Sir Walter Raleigh?
Well, that was one idea. Raleigh at that time was banished from court, I believe. Although he was still a member of Parliament, he went in and out of favor over the years. He was a troublemaker. Raleigh definitely was. I mean, we know that Marlowe spent time in the Raleigh circle. A lot of it's supposition, but it was known that Marlowe was friendly to the people around Raleigh, and harming Marlowe was a way of harming Sir Walter Raleigh. But at that time, Raleigh had very little influence. So, because at the time Marlowe was killed, he was under arrest. Technically, he had bail, so-called parole. He had to report to the Privy Council on a daily basis until they got around to dealing with him. But in the meantime, he was staying with Walsingham, and I just was looking at some information here about the men who were present when Marlowe died, and it's interesting to see who these lowlifes were affiliated with. Now, Ingram, I'm going to read verbatim from this article. Ingram Fraser was in the service of Thomas Walsingham of Chislehurst, a cousin of the late great spy master Sir Francis Walsingham. So there's intelligence work right there. The same Thomas Walsingham was Marlowe's master or patron. At this time, Marlowe was living with him at Scadbury. That's who he was staying with. Fraser had a somewhat shady background. He was later involved in the loan sharking that Roger was talking about. And there is evidence that he was a spy in the service of Thomas Walsingham for a considerable period. And Thomas worked, as a controller of a number of spies employed by Francis Walsingham. Now, Nicholas Skeers was an accomplice to Fraser in that blackmailing episode. In fact, he was a very shady guy. His name shows up on a list compiled in 1585 of a number of masterless men and cutpurses whose practice is to rob gentlemen's chambers and artificers' shops in and about London. But then the same Skeers shows up as a government plant in the Babington plot. And by 1589, he was working in the Essex spy service, doing work for which he received official payment under a warrant signed by Sir Francis Walsingham. In the course of the evidence he gave concerning his dealing with Wulfoyle the Skinner, he describes the Earl of Essex as, quote, his lord and master. So, and he goes on to say, of the three men present at the stabbing of Marlowe, Poley is the most complex and the most sinister. His career as a spy went well back over 2 decades, taken him to many countries as well as into the Tower and the Marshalsea. Notorious among Catholics as a double dealer, informer, agent provocateur, and poisoner. He's been called the very genius of the Elizabethan underworld.
Wow.
And this was one of the points, and I was talking about this before, on the day of Marlowe's death, Poley had returned from one of his confidential missions to the Netherlands. 2 weeks later, he received payment of £30 for this work on a warrant signed by Sir Thomas Heneage. Poley was Robert Cecil's man, but Poley was supposed to be traveling on post in haste, so apparently delivering messages back and forth. But he spent a week after returning to England, including the time that included Marlowe's death, before reporting back. So technically, when Marlowe was killed, this guy was officially on the clock for the crown.
Ooh.
And they made no thing about when they said on 2 weeks later he received his payment. They didn't make any. There was apparently no static about the fact that he took that long, even though he was supposedly on post, in haste. So, so that also is suggestive that he was still doing government work at that time. So all these guys were not just like really kind of low life underworld figures, but they were underworld figures with connections to the two competing intelligence agencies, Essex and Berkeley, the Cecils there.
Right.
And see, with William Cecil, with Francis Bacon, at the same time that all this was going on, you got to remember Francis Bacon was also in Europe at the time, not in England. He was an ambassador for the Queen overseas. I believe it was in Paris. He was in France.
Yeah. And he and his brother both were closely associated with intelligence work as well. Anthony Bacon in particular. So yeah, there are a lot of weird interconnecting intelligence agency tentacles here. So Bacon did know it, he was moving in circles that would have known of Marlowe, and so that they were in contact is not unlikely.
Fascinating. You suggest, Otto, it seems from what you just read, that there could be a suggestion there that the Queen ordered his assassination.
That could be, although I always tend to think, I like to use Occam's razor. I mean, if someone like the Queen or even just a powerful nobleman really just wanted him dead, a very easy thing to arrange. I mean, this guy lived on the edge with underworld figures, a knife in an alley somewhere, and dumped off a bridge or pitched over the side of a boat. Well, next time he was going over to the Netherlands, just send a couple of guys with him. So I think if she just wanted him dead, she'd just order him dead. I think it might be more that people that killed him, and this is assuming he was killed, we're leaving out the idea that they might have faked his death, might have just not wanted certain information to come up, because the Privy Council did have competing factions on it. And that's an old tried and true thing they teach you at King's School is, you have competing agencies, and they had competing intelligence agencies, and you it keeps them honest that way. And if they're fighting each other, they don't have time to try to pull you down. So there might have been a group on the Privy Council that were afraid that Marlowe would reveal things that would be inconvenient for them. And I just get the feeling that when he died, there were these three guys present, all of whom had more or less obvious connections to the same intelligence community that Marlowe was in. Marlowe was scheduled to be questioned under torture, and who knows what he might have been threatening to say if they didn't get him out of this, or was going to say, or what they were afraid he would say. So it could have been higher ups just didn't want whatever he was going to say to get out. And he was already under the supervision of the Privy Council, because there were some people that did want that stuff to get out. So they didn't really have a chance to kill him too easily. But this would have been a way to do it. And I mean, the whole thing, there's three of us. There's this guy lying down on a bed. He started attacking us, so we stabbed him in the eye. We couldn't do anything else. There were only three of us. We were helpless, It's like, it just seems a little, suspicious to me.
Very, very strange.
And you got to realize there's at least 3 or 4 times that this man had been arrested and he had gotten off scot-free. And not only did he get off scot-free, but like within days after being arrested, he was released.
Yeah.
I mean,
there were higher powers looking out for him. So he was
Yeah.
involved with these guys, but it's dangerous to get involved with those guys too sometimes.
Yep.
You know too
And
much, or
he was 26 when he was killed.
Mhm.
Is that right?
He was a very young man. Yeah, that's something I was talking about the other day. That the youth of all these people, the energy they had. You know, when you're going to college at 13, 14, 15, and you're starting your career in the world at like 19, 20, 21. And of course, back then you were very often dead before you were 40. You know, I think the average life expectancy was something like in the late 30s. Some people did live to have a ripe old age, but it was very, very, very easy to die back then. I forget who it was. I think it might have been Pepys, but somebody like was getting a splinter out of their finger or something, or a little worm or something was in their finger. They pricked it out with a pin, and they were dead a week later from like blood poisoning and sepsis. You know, just a little cut. We don't think anything of it. We just put a little peroxide on it or methylate.
Yeah.
But yeah, death always walked very close to them all. So they started their life young, and man, when you're that young, just the intensity of the things you do. Some of them wacky and zany, like brawling into the streets of London and writing amazing plays.
Well, it's just like in those talking notes that I mentioned in there. There's part in there about Marlowe's plays, you know, and how everybody tries to make him out to be like he was a humanist, and he had realistic emotions and all that stuff. But if you read what he's saying, I mean, he was an anti-intellectual. You know what I mean? A lot of his writings involved violence, cruelty, and bloodshed. You know, I mean, where they come up with that, I don't understand that about him being like a humanist and all that stuff. In his writings, he was very brutal. I mean, for that time and age, he really was.
Yeah. Well, they always try to project these things. You know, he's great, therefore he has to be what we think a great person should be. But no, he was writing some stuff that, if he was around today, he'd be making movies, and he'd be making movies like Die Hard, action, adventure, things blowing up, people fighting each other, the conflict, he loved that kind of thing. And, that I think that a lot of his, and even like, Faust, which is, has less action, but there's a great deal of intellectual struggle there. Faust wrestling with himself even, there's all times in there when he's trying to turn away from this course that's taking him literally to hell. And every time he just fails, but the struggle is there. And you do get a lot of, apparently I've read accounts of when they did Faust, the play, they did use a lot of special effects that the audience loved, I'm sure. They used firecrackers, which were very new at the time, sparklers, and lots of like smoking sulfur for special effects, people in devil costumes. Supposedly scared the heck out of the kids.
This is the most fascinating conversation. We haven't even started getting into his work or how it corresponds to Shakespeare or Bacon or any of the other guys that were there at the time. And we haven't even mentioned that this gruesome death of his happened before a lot of the Shakespeare plays were published. But the saddest thing of all is that we've come to the end of our time today. And so I need to wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for listening. It is so great that we've had you with us and that you've stuck with us through this really fascinating discussion. I'm not sure if we're going to be back next week, but we will be back. And so if you have any questions, if you would like us to investigate anything, please drop them there in the comments. We will do our best to look at your ideas and your perspectives and your take on it. And go ahead. Questions and comments, really welcome. And finally, it comes to thanking you, Otto and Roger, for your insight into this and for your time. It's a fascinating conversation, and I really hope we can do it again soon.
No problem.
Thanks
Thanks
very
for
much.
having me.
So
Yeah, it was a
good.
lot of fun. We're going to have to do another show on this topic, though. We have a lot further to go, so I think this might turn into a multi-part show if Roger's up for it.
Oh yeah, I love it, and like I said, I'm really thankful that you actually come in and want to have a conversation with me, Otto, because you can't find too many people that even want to have a conversation about this. So
You're right.
I'm really
Yeah.
I'm
No,
really
I'm glad. I'm glad you want to talk about it too. Like you say, it's very hard to find people that are talk on this topic. So we're having a lot of fun with this. We should keep going with this for a while.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Yay. Okay, so we will very likely be back next week. So guys, look out for the link and we will see you again next time. Until then, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
I lost my mouse, sorry. Okay.